Welcome to Whispy History, where the past drifts softly through the veil of time and stories unfold like forgotten dreams. Each night, we journey together through the echoes of history, tales of empires, philosophers, inventors, and mysteries that shaped our world, one whispered story at a time. Before we begin, take a moment, breathe in, settle down, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far our quiet community reaches. If you'd like to keep these stories alive, you can support Whispy History by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now, find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, and let your mind drift as we step softly into tonight's story. Before we can truly understand Cleopatra, we have to understand her city. Alexandria, her capital, did not feel like Egypt in the way the Nile Valley did. It looked north and west across the Mediterranean more than south toward the river and the deserts. Think of it as a seafront outpost of Greek life planted on African shores. Something like a bustling colonial port, a little like Philadelphia facing inland America in the 1600s, or Bombay fronting India in the 1700s. It drew its wealth from ships, trade, and ideas moving over water. And just as you would never call William Penn a native Indian, it would be misleading to call Cleopatra a native Egyptian because she ruled from Alexandria. She lived apart from the old Egypt of temples and tombs. We do not even know that she ever saw the Sphinx. The one grand journey up the Nile that we can trace seems to have been at Caesar's urging. Alexander the Great chose the site with exactly this separation in mind. He set his new city on a narrow strip of land between the open Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis, so it would be both near Egypt and apart from it, Greek in character, master of the coast, and gatekeeper for the river's riches. That plan worked. Even today, with fast trains linking Alexandria to Cairo, many city dwellers barely venture inland. In Cleopatra's time, the same coastal spirit prevailed. Greeks, Levantines, Jews, and many foreigners filled its streets. They traded on the quays, and they felt themselves citizens of the Mediterranean world more than children of the Nile. The Egypt that travelers imagine, the endless sky over the desert, the slow shining river, shadufs lifting water, creaking wooden wheels, palms shading clustered mud brick homes, ruined temples and pyramids, was not the daily Alexandria Cleopatra knew. Alexandrians breathed sea air, not desert stillness. They were people of harbors and markets and marble colonnades, not fields and floodplains. The climate reinforced the difference. Upper Egypt around Thebes could be a furnace by day and sharply cold at night. Cairo's heat was softer but still heavy. Alexandria, by contrast, often felt like southern Europe. Early summer, there could be close to perfect. Blue days, clean breezes, cool nights. August and September brought dampness and some discomfort, but rarely the brutal heat inland. Winter could turn rainy and blustery, with a salt wind racing the streets and a chill that asked for thick clothing and a watchful eye on the barometer. It was the weather of Italy more than of the Nile. No wonder officials from the south fled to Alexandria when summer grew fierce, arriving with sunburned faces and pith helmets and finding to their surprise that they needed a blanket at night. So it is not hard to imagine Cleopatra adopting the view of many Alexandrians. The interior felt far away, different, and sometimes looked down upon. The city's roots were Greek. Its daily life was cosmopolitan, its temper, European. Even the gardens told the story. Inland lawns had to be sown each autumn and struggled through summer. In and around Alexandria, flowers flared all season. Hollyhocks and foxgloves beside plants of the southern coasts. And in spring, the fields of Mariut blazed with poppies, daisies, asphodel, iris, and great ranunculus blooms, like a carpet from Greece spread along the African shore. Now, picture the approach from the sea. The Egyptian coast is low. Sailors could not see it from far off, as they could the mountains of Greece or Sicily. Vessels often had to come close before land resolved out of the haze. Alexandria itself sat modestly behind a long, low island called Pharos. The city hid until you were nearly upon it. One thing, though, no mariner could miss: the lighthouse, the Pharos, at the island's eastern tip. Raised in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus by the architect Sostratus of Cnidus, about 2 centuries before Cleopatra, it was counted among the wonders of the world. Built of pale stone, rising to an astonishing height, ancient writers say about 400 ells, nearly 600 feet, it gleamed by day and shone by night, its beacon said to be visible dozens of miles at sea. It was both symbol and guide, drawing every hull and sail toward the harbor mouth. The harbor itself was a pair of harbors divided by a long causeway called the Heptastadion, 7 stadia in length, roughly 1,400 yards, linking the mainland to Pharos Island. To the west lay the harbor of Eunostos, Happy Return. To the east, the Great Harbor, entered by steering between the lighthouse on Pharos and a long breakwater thrown out from the headland of Lochias. That eastern entrance could be tricky. The channel was narrow. Hidden rocks waited beneath the swell, and the north winds drove waves hard against the stone. If you came in that way on a calm day, you would pass beneath the lighthouse, skirts of white spray flicking at your hull, and then slip into clear, sheltered water where you could see sunlight dapple the sand and rocks below. Seaweeds of unusual colors clung to the stones. Anemones opened and closed like underwater flowers. Dolphins arched and vanished with casual grace. And ahead, the city revealed itself. Terraces of pale buildings, steps leading into blue water, colonnades and gardens shining against the sky. On your left rose the royal quarter spread along the Lochias promontory, palaces upon palaces, and before them a smaller island, Antirodos, with a royal pavilion. Here, flights of stone led down to water so deep that even the largest galleys could tie directly to the quay. Close by stood the museum, part institute, part sanctuary of learning, where scholars dined in a common hall, debated under sheltered arcades, lectured in assembly rooms, and walked to the great library, which held, in Cleopatra's day, more than 500,000 scrolls. On higher ground behind stood the theater, higher still the Paneum, an artificial, cone-shaped mound with a spiral path to its top, an open-air lookout from which one could take in the whole city at a glance. West of the mound ran the long porticos of the gymnasium, themselves longer than a stadium, around 200 yards, flanked by law courts set among groves and gardens. Near the quays was the Forum, and on the quay a temple of Neptune. Not far away lay the Sema, an enclosed precinct of royal tombs clustered around the celebrated mausoleum of Alexander the Great, said to contain his body in an alabaster sarcophagus. All of this, the palaces, statues, steps, and flowered courts, formed the Regia, the royal area, the bright front of Alexandria to the sea. Step ashore and you would meet the city's backbone, the Street of Canopus, a grand, straight boulevard over 3 miles long and about 100 feet wide, colonnaded on both sides. It ran from the western gate of the necropolis, behind the western harbor, all the way to the eastern gate of Canopus beyond the royal headland. Walk east along it, and you would pass the Jewish quarter with its synagogues, go out beyond the walls to sandy ground and the racecourse, the hippodrome, and a windy seafront grove. There, palm trees leaned south under the steady sea breeze, and acacias cast stingy patches of shade. The little suburb of Eleusis stood nearby, filled with restaurants and noisy amusements that respectable folk pretended to dislike. Farther still, beyond the city limits, lay Nicopolis, lined with summer villas fronting the water, with crowds bathing along the sands when the heat allowed. Head west instead, and the Grand Street would carry you through the royal quarter, then into Rakotis, the Egyptian district near the commercial harbor. Warehouses, offices, and docks crowded that shore. An inner basin, Sabodos, the Ark, held shipyards. A canal ran beneath the great street to Lake Mariotis at the city's back. Above Rakotis, on a rocky height, rose the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, approached by a broad cross street that effectively extended the heptastadion to the city's heart. Ancient writers ranked the Serapeum alongside the Capitol in Rome, a place of massive dignity, raised high to catch the clean wind. Behind it, the stadium sat on open ground. Beyond that lay the necropolis with its gardens and tombs. And farther still, villas and plots whose flowers may still echo today in the wild blooms of that soil. Lake Mareotis stretched the length of the city's southern walls, a barrier of water as effective as desert. Barges and lakecraft brought Egypt's produce across its surface to the capital's lake harbor and docks. Those docks opened into the city not far east of the Paneum, and from them a second great colonnaded thoroughfare ran north to the sea and south to a gate named for the sun, its ends called appropriately the Gate of the Moon and the Gate of the Sun. The lake docks were at least as busy and wealthy as the sea docks, for the traffic by river and canal from all corners of Egypt never ceased. Around the lake's edges, papyrus thickets stood thick, and Alexandrians loved to picnic there, rowing into the shelter of the reeds, using the broad leaves as makeshift plates and cups. Orchards and vineyards lined the shore, and islands in the lake were said to be smothered in gardens. Alexandria itself overflowed with parks, promenades, and grand buildings. Streets were broad enough for chariots to pass. The three principal avenues, to Canopus, to the Serapeum, and to the lake harbor, were especially splendid. The Ptolemies had spent nearly 3 centuries adorning their capital until, in Cleopatra's time, it rivaled Rome for magnificence and ease. Visitors spoke of being dazzled by the white stone and the shining water and the way sunlight pooled in the colonnades. It was a city that made eyes ache with brightness and hearts swell with wonder. And who lived there? Almost everyone, it seemed. The population hovered around 300,000 in the later Ptolemaic years, close to Rome before the civil wars, and twice Rome's number afterward. The Greek element was dominant, mostly Macedonian by origin, though by Cleopatra's day, many families had mixed Greek and Egyptian blood. There were also pure Macedonian houses, proud of their lineage, and proud Egyptian families too. Greek and Egyptian were both widely spoken, and official decrees were published in both languages. Names crossed between cultures. In addition to Greeks and Egyptians, there were Italians, Cretans, Phoenicians, Cilicians, Cypriots, Persians, Syrians, Armenians, Arabs, a whole Levantine web shaped by trade, service, and chance. Some came as merchants, some as sailors or pirates, some as runaways or debtors who earned entry by serving in the army, others as soldiers of fortune. A Roman-sponsored garrison, the Gabinian force, many from Gaul and Germany, had settled in the city and married into local families. Their presence added northern faces and Roman discipline to the streets, and sometimes sparked rivalry with the palace guard. But even the Macedonian household troops had, by Cleopatra's time, been recruited from wherever men could be found. The city's upper classes were a cosmopolitan blend, officers of both mercenary and Roman units, Macedonian courtiers, Greek and Egyptian officials, and many wealthy families from across the eastern Mediterranean. The scholars of the museum formed their own honored circle, supported by the court, respected for learning even if they did not always grace the fashionable dinner lists. The crowd, though, was another matter. Noisy, quick to anger, quick to laugh, endlessly excitable. Greeks and Jews quarreled often. Greeks and Egyptians tended to mix more easily. Similar in temperament, arguing rarely over religion because their gods matched and merged, Serapis in particular being adored by both. Their arts were essentially Greek, Egyptian styles having long since yielded to Hellenic taste. Both peoples worked hard for wealth and were equally ready to cast off work for pleasure when the city called, and Alexandria adored its pleasures, theater first of all. Writers speak of audiences who lost themselves in spectacle, music, races, festivals, so completely that for days afterwards the streets bubbled with the afterfroth of excitement. They were sharp-tongued and merciless in their humor, quick to pin nicknames on rulers: bloated, vetch, piper, pickled fish peddler, and equally quick to sing scandalous verses about emperors. Sometimes the jokes were dangerous. When a group mocked Caracalla, he answered with slaughter. Yet the wit of Alexandria traveled. Songs and jibes made their way to Rome and were sung there to knowing laughter. They could be vain, fickle, and spiteful, these Alexandrians. That too is in the record. They loved fine houses and refined food. They followed horse racing as if it were a civic religion. They lacked deep civic traditions. Patriotism meant less to them than prosperity and amusement. If the government offended, they rioted. Life was cheap in the streets when tempers ran high. For all that, Alexandria was one of the world's beating hearts. Above all, a city of trade. It was the grain market of the Mediterranean, a fact that made Rome both hungry for it and wary of its power. In Cleopatra's time, people ate proportionally more grain than we do now. Caesars bragged of soldiers who endured meat when grain was short. But corn was only part of the traffic. Goods from east and west met here. And a new route to India was drawing caravans and ships toward the city as never before. Alexandria was also a lighthouse of learning. The great Alexandrian school of science and poetry had flourished for 2 centuries, and though dimmed by Cleopatra's day, still cast its glow. A new school of philosophy was rising. The city remained a final authority by its own proud estimate on taste and intellect. Sculptures like the famous figure of Nilus were claimed as its work. Scholars, merchants, poets, mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, all eyes turned to Alexandria, and courts across the world took note of what it thought beautiful and true. This is the city Cleopatra ruled from, a sea-washed capital, Greek in spirit and global in reach, glittering with palaces and libraries, noisy with jokes and arguments, mercantile to its core, and only lightly touched by the ancient hush of the Nile. Understand Alexandria, its harbors and streets, its lighthouse and libraries, its mixed blood and restless heart, and you begin to understand the queen who shaped her life within its walls. And now, with the surf quieting outside the great harbor and the lighthouse flame steady against the night, let us rest here a moment, on a balcony above the colonnades, in the cool breath from the sea, before we follow Cleopatra into the turning of her fate. Let's begin softly with a simple truth. Cleopatra was the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic line, the 7th queen of her name, and with her, the long story of Greek pharaohs ruling Egypt reached its end. 2.5 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, a Macedonian general named Ptolemy, son of Lagus, took Egypt after Alexander the Great died. He made Alexandria his capital, a new city on the sea, and founded a dynasty that would steer Egypt's fortunes for generations. These rulers were Greeks, not Egyptians. Their palaces, language, clothing, ceremonies at court, these were Greek. They spoke Greek with a Macedonian breadth. They lived by Mediterranean habits, and except for ritual occasions, they did not dress like the ancient pharaohs. Yet Egypt accepted them. In the temples up and down the Nile, artists carved and painted the Ptolemies as the old kings had been, wearing the high crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, the sacred uraeus upon the brow, embraced by Isis, greeted by Osiris, hailed as child of the sun and living image of Amun. In painted scenes, they bowed before Hathor, offered incense to Bast, and honored Sobek of the river. But this was theater for the gods and the priesthood. In daily life, the Ptolemies remained what they were, Greek monarchs ruling from a cosmopolitan port city whose eyes looked out to sea. Sometimes a king would travel up the Nile, visit a provincial temple, and perform the set rites, much as a modern sovereign might lay a cornerstone or launch a ship. Mostly, though, the court stayed in Alexandria, and its life felt European rather than Egyptian. The Ptolemies patronized learning, art, and science with uncommon zeal. Under their protection, Alexandria became the great seat of research and letters, birthplace or home to anatomy and geometry, conic sections and hydrostatics, geography and astronomy. The palace glittered with wealth and ceremony. But there is a darker strand in this family history. Many Ptolemaic rulers were startlingly careless of human life. Murders within the royal house thread through the generations. Brothers at brothers' throats, mothers against sons, queens at war with queens. Some kings grew grotesque with excess. Nicknames clung to them in the streets. Physcon, the bloated, Lathyrus with his flower-like nose, others who needed crutches from indulgence, or who insisted that guests drink to stupefaction to prove their loyalty. It is a grim gallery. Against that backdrop, one might expect Cleopatra to be all vice and ruthlessness. Yet, as her story unfolds, we will find more nuance. Flaws, yes, but also purpose, restraint, and a striking steadiness when it mattered. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, known as Auletes, the Piper. He loved wine, music, and the merry rites of Dionysus. He also lived with a constant fear: Rome. By the 1st century before Christ, Rome's grip on the eastern Mediterranean was tightening. It had money troubles after long wars, it craved grain, gold, and safe sea lanes, and it watched Egypt, the richest prize, with patient hunger. Auletes owed his throne in part to Roman favor. He paid dearly to be recognized as friend and ally of the Roman people. Bribes flowed from Alexandria to the Senate. Loans were raised from the great Roman financier Rabirius Postumus and his circle, and in return, Roman officers and soldiers settled in Egypt. A garrison, the Gabiniani, remained in Alexandria after a Roman general, Aulus Gabinius, restored Auletes to power. Many of these troops were Gauls and Germans, large, rough men who married into local families and became a force of their own within the city. When Cyprus, ruled by Auletes' brother, fell to Roman annexation, the brother took poison rather than submit. In Alexandria, popular anger over new taxes and Roman intrusions flared into revolt. Auletes fled. His daughter Berenice IV seized the throne, so the king sailed to Rome, begged and borrowed. Political winds shifted. Oracles were consulted, deals were struck. At last, Gabinius took Auletes' money and marched an army across the desert. A brilliant young cavalry officer named Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, took the frontier fortress of Pelusium. Archelaus, Berenice's consort, fell in battle, and Auletes returned. Berenice was executed. The Roman garrison stayed. Roman creditors took charge of Egypt's finances. And the king piped again in his palace, weary and watchful. During these troubled years, Cleopatra came of age. Born in the winter of 69-68 BC, she was about 14 when Antony first passed through Alexandria, their meeting, if it happened at all then, no more than a flicker in the corner of a crowded scene. We catch our first clear view of her in action a little later. When the governor of Syria, Bibulus, tried to summon the Alexandrian garrison for a Parthian campaign, the Gabiniani mutinied and murdered his 2 sons. Cleopatra, now acting with authority, ordered the ringleaders arrested and sent in chains to Bibulus. He returned them, saying only the Senate could judge them. The episode ends in silence, but it shows the young queen's instinct for firm, careful dealing with Rome. Soon after, Pompey's son, Cneius, came to Egypt, seeking ships and men for the looming Roman civil war. Alexandria provided 50 warships and 500 troops. Gossip said the young Roman admired Cleopatra. Politics whispered of a possible alliance through marriage. Nothing came of it. The city returned to its uneasy routines. In 51 BC, Auletes died. He left 4 children by a second marriage, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The eldest was Cleopatra, about 18. Next was her sister Arsinoe, younger and quick-tempered. Then came a boy of 10 or 11, later called Ptolemy XIV, and the youngest, a boy of 7 or 8, who would one day be known as Ptolemy XV, Caesarion. Auletes, mindful of how he had suffered, left a precise will. 1 copy stayed in Alexandria. Another, sealed, he gave to Pompey in Rome for the state treasury. In it, he required that his eldest surviving daughter and eldest surviving son should reign together, and, by customary practice, marry to confirm the joint claim. He begged the Roman people to see this arrangement upheld and asked them to serve as guardians to the young king. He feared, perhaps, that one child might destroy another. He knew too well the habits of his house. The marriage, if planned, seems to have been delayed. Cleopatra likely argued the boy's youth. Greek minds did not favor child marriages, even if Egypt sometimes allowed them. In any case, formal state business passed largely through Cleopatra's hands. But real power did not go uncontested. Around the young Ptolemy gathered three figures: Pothinos, a eunuch and nimble intriguer; Theodotos, a Greek rhetorician with a cutting tongue; and Achilles, a hard, ambitious commander of the palace troops. Together they built a party around the boy and set themselves against Cleopatra's circle. For a while, the arrangement held. The queen conducted ceremonies and decrees. The king's guardians pressed their advantage in the background. Then, in 48 BC, the balance broke. We do not have the details, the slammed doors, the midnight flights, the whispers in corridors, but the shape of events is clear. The king's party moved first. Cleopatra was pushed out, forced to run for her life into Syria. From there, she raised mercenaries, gathered allies, and turned back toward Egypt with an army at her side. She was about 21. Her brother was 14. On Egypt's eastern frontier, the young king's forces waited to bar her way. Behind him stood Pothinos, Theodotos, and Achilles, hands on his shoulders, telling him he was the sole ruler now. Ahead, across the scrub and sand, Cleopatra advanced. Unyielding, quick to act, already the strategist we will come to know. Pause with her for a moment on that line of march. A young woman, exiled by her own court, setting her jaw against the wind from the desert, determined to take back what she had lost. In the distance, the city of her birth, its lighthouse a needle of white, and between them a reckoning that would draw the greatest men of Rome into Egypt's story. This is where her true life begins. The story opens on the windswept coast near Pelusium, Egypt's eastern gate to the sea, not far from where modern Port Said stands today. The desert sand here met the Mediterranean in a lonely, shifting border between Africa and Asia. To the west stretched the broad Nile Delta. To the east, the dusty road that wound towards Syria. It was late September in the year 48 BC. The fortress of Pelusium stood guard over this coast, its walls low and strong, its flag snapping in the dry wind. Within those walls, the young King Ptolemy and his advisors waited with their army. Beyond them, across the dunes, the exiled Queen Cleopatra had returned from Syria at the head of her own troops, determined to reclaim her throne. But as her soldiers camped beside the sea, something unexpected appeared around the headland. A single ship, its sails slack, its deck crowded with weary men. From its bow stepped an aging figure whose name had once shaken empires. Pompey the Great, once the master of Rome, now a fugitive after his crushing defeat by Julius Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalia. Beside him stood his wife, Cornelia, her face drawn with worry. Pompey had come seeking refuge, and perhaps aid, from the Egyptian king whose family had long been under his protection. But fate, in the form of three men around the boy king's throne, had already decided otherwise. News of Pompey's approach threw the Egyptian camp into confusion. Ptolemy was barely 15, a pawn in the hands of his chief ministers, Pothinos, the eunuch who ruled the court, Achilles, commander of the army, and Theodotus of Chios, the king's tutor, a sharp-tongued man trained in Greek rhetoric. These three had already schemed to drive Cleopatra from Egypt, and now, with the world's most famous Roman general at their doorstep, they sensed another chance to play power's game. Should they welcome Pompey as a guest, aid him against Caesar, or betray him to win Caesar's favor? Some counseled caution. Send him politely away, they said, before Caesar's wrath descends on us. Others argued to support him. Pompey still had ships and loyal soldiers. With Egyptian gold, he might yet rise again. But Theodotus, cold and clever, smiled and said, "If we aid him, we make Caesar our enemy. If we refuse him, Pompey will hate us. Better to destroy him. Dead men bite no more." So it was agreed. Achillas and 2 Roman officers in Egyptian pay, Septimius, who had once served under Pompey, and a centurion named Salvius, rowed out to the ship in a small boat to perform their dreadful errand. When the boat came alongside, Septimius saluted Pompey as general, calling him by his old Roman title. Achillas invited him to come ashore, saying the larger ship could not enter the shallow harbor. On deck, Cornelia grew uneasy. Egyptian warships patrolled nearby, soldiers crowded the sands, and the little boat below looked ominously still. Pompey, weary and uncertain, turned to her with a faint smile. He told her to be brave, quoting softly from the Greek poet Sophocles, "He that once enters at a tyrant's door becomes a slave, though he were free before." Then, taking 2 attendants and his freedman Philip, he climbed down into the smaller craft. The oarsmen rowed silently toward shore. The Nile's early flood had already turned the sea's edge brown and thick with silt. The humid air pressed heavily upon them. To break the silence, Pompey turned to Septimius and said quietly, "Surely I know you. Were you not once my fellow soldier?" Septimius gave only a nod. Pompey looked down and began reading from a small notebook he carried. As the boat grounded on the sand, he rose and reached for Philip's hand to steady himself. In that instant, Septimius struck him from behind. Achillas and Salvius joined in. Pompey uttered no cry, only a low groan, and drew his cloak over his face as he fell. On the ship offshore, Cornelia saw it all. Her scream carried across the water as the assassins lifted their swords. And when she saw them raise Pompey's severed head, she ordered her captain to flee. Her galley turned and vanished into the open sea. Pompey's naked body was left to drift ashore. Crowds soon gathered, curious but indifferent, staring down at what remained of the once great conqueror. That night, when the crowds dispersed, the freedman Philip crept back to the shore. He washed his master's body with seawater, wrapped it in his own garment, and searched the beach for wood. There he met another old Roman soldier who had served under Pompey. Together they gathered scraps of wreckage and driftwood, built a small pyre, and gave their general a poor man's funeral by the water's edge. At dawn, another of Pompey's commanders, Lucius Lentulus, arrived by sea, unaware of what had happened. Seeing the smoke still rising from the beach, he murmured, "Who is it that has found his end here? Perhaps even thou, Pompey the Great." He, too, was murdered when he came ashore. Only a few days later, on October 2nd, Julius Caesar himself arrived in Egypt, following swiftly after his rival. When he learned how Pompey had been killed, he was appalled. Theodotus, eager to impress, brought to him a basket containing Pompey's head and his signet ring. Caesar turned away, covering his face, and wept. He accepted only the ring, dismissing Theodotus in disgust. Later, that wretched man would be hunted down and crucified for his treachery. Caesar ordered that Pompey's remains be buried honorably near the sea, in the grove of Nemesis outside Alexandria's eastern walls. There, a monument was raised amid the shade of tamarisk trees. He sent Pompey's ashes to his widow Cornelia, who laid them to rest in Italy. For a brief moment, Caesar set aside conquest and played the mourner, honoring the greatness of the enemy he had destroyed. But in the Egyptian court, fear rippled like heat over sand. Pothinos and Achillas understood that Caesar's pity for Pompey might soon turn to wrath against them. They whispered and schemed, hoping he would sail away before revenge found them. Yet Caesar had no intention of leaving. Calmly, almost casually, he took residence in the royal palace on the Lochias Promontory, a marble complex overlooking the harbor, where 2 young royals still resided. King Ptolemy and his sister Arsinoe. With him landed 2 legions, about 4,000 men, and a troop of Celtic and German cavalry. It was not a large force, but Caesar, fresh from victory at Pharsalia, feared nothing. His plan had been simple: pursue Pompey, prevent Egypt from giving him aid, and then use his authority to settle the country's disputes in Rome's name. Now Pompey was dead, and Caesar saw a different opportunity. He would stay, reorganize Egypt's affairs, and establish himself as its protector, perhaps its unseen ruler. To him, Alexandria seemed a splendid stage for power and peace after months of war. When Caesar's lictors marched before him through Alexandria's streets, carrying the faces, those Roman bundles of rods and axes that symbolized command, the crowds hissed and shouted. The Egyptians saw it as an insult to their king. The Roman exiles and criminals living there saw it as a threat to their lawless freedom. Mobs surged, stones flew, soldiers fell. For several tense days, riots flared across the city. Caesar fortified the palace quarter, walls thick, towers strong, the harbor at his back for retreat if needed. But within those walls, he felt safe. His nerves, worn by years of battle, longed for rest. The warm air of Alexandria felt almost like a holiday. He had little reason to hurry back to Rome. The city was still restless after civil war. The people adored the dead Pompey more than the living victor. A few quiet weeks in Egypt, Caesar thought, would serve him well. Once settled, he sent word to both royal claimants, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, ordering them to cease their conflict and present themselves before him for judgment. He reminded them that their late father, Ptolemy Auletes, had entrusted his will to Rome, naming its people as guardians of his heirs. Ptolemy obeyed at once, arriving in Alexandria with his advisor Pothinos, while his general Achillas remained at Pelusium with the army. Caesar asked that the army be dismissed. Pothinos refused, secretly sending word for Achillas to march on the capital. When Caesar tried to stop him by dispatching messengers, they were killed en route. Soon Achillas was at Alexandria's gates with 20,000 men and 2,000 cavalry. Caesar had only 4,000, but he held hostages: King Ptolemy, young Prince Ptolemy, Princess Arsinoe, and the crafty Pothinos himself. Behind his walls and guarded ships, he felt confident. Only one thing was missing: Cleopatra. He had summoned her too, but the roads were dangerous. Achillas's troops blocked the way. Still, Cleopatra was not a woman to be stopped by armies. One quiet evening, after sunset, a small boat slipped into Alexandria's great harbor. In it sat a Sicilian named Apollodorus, and beside him, wrapped in a bundle of bedding and tied with a rope, the Queen of Egypt herself. They waited under the shadow of the palace walls until night deepened. Then Apollodorus lifted the bundle onto his shoulders and walked calmly through the gates, pretending it was ordinary baggage for one of Caesar's soldiers. No one stopped him. Inside the palace, he was shown into Caesar's quarters. The bundle was set down, the ropes untied, and out stepped Cleopatra, breathless, laughing, her hair loose from the journey. Caesar, astonished, could only stare. Plutarch writes that he was captivated by the proof of her bold wit. In that moment, the daring of her entry, the sparkle in her eyes, something passed between them that would change the fate of Egypt and Rome alike. All night they talked. She told him her story, her exile, her flight, her return, and he listened, fascinated by her courage and charm. Outside, the sea murmured against the quay, the warm wind carried the scent of salt and lotus, and the first chapter of their legendary alliance had begun. Here's a calm, modern English bedtime retelling of Caius Julius Caesar, keeping the facts intact and told in a warm, unhurried storyteller's voice. When Cleopatra first met Julius Caesar in Alexandria, he was a man in late middle age, 54, born on July 12, 102 BC, still astonishingly energetic, though time had begun to write its lines across his face. The wild living of his youth had taken a toll, yet he moved with the easy grace of someone who trusted his body. He was lightly built, impeccably groomed, and carried himself like a natural horseman. In Gaul, he'd broken and ridden a mount no one else dared approach, and he liked to show his perfect seat by clasping his hands behind his back while galloping. He swam strongly, fenced cleanly, and in battle kept his head, bareheaded among his men, calling them on with a quick smile and a steady voice. Look at him closely, and you'd see the hard planes of his clean-shaven face, keen dark eyes, a firm mouth that could soften into humor, and a complexion a touch pale. His toga bore a broad purple stripe and long fringe. His scant hair was carefully arranged. He had a weakness for fine things, and once bought a single pearl for a staggering sum, later gifting it to a lady. People teased that his invasion of Britain owed something to rumors of good pearls there. There was a streak of vanity in his appearance, yes, but it hid a mind of iron and a will that rarely bent. He spoke with clarity, sometimes almost pedantic in word choice, his voice high but capable of warmth. In company, he was courteous and calm, a gentleman to the eye. Beneath that polish lived a tireless soldier and organizer. He was also, it must be said plainly, an unscrupulous man when ambition pressed. He had immense gifts and a grand vision for ordering the world, but he did not let principle stand in the way of power or pleasure. His fame with women was notorious. When he returned from Gaul, his own troops sang a marching jibe, warning Roman husbands to guard their wives. As a very young man, he chased affairs recklessly, endured jokes about a period of affected effeminacy, and carried on liaisons even when politics should have counseled restraint, Pompey's wife Mucia among them. He could turn even this knowledge of fashionable youth to tactical use. Before Pharsalia, he told his infantry to strike at the patrician cavalrymen's faces. The young nobles, he judged, would fear a scar more than a wound, and they broke. With money, he was just as free-handed and just as careless. He borrowed vast sums to rise in Roman politics. He borrowed again to keep his allies afloat. He won favor with spectacular games and feasts, once feeding tens of thousands at a single sitting, paying for hundreds of gladiatorial combats, costs later recouped on conquered peoples. Nothing mattered more than advancement. He could not abide being second. He once said he would rather be first in a little Alpine village than second in Rome. He wept reading of Alexander, tormented that the Macedonian had won the world at an age when Caesar had not. Cicero, watching him fuss over his hair, joked that such a carefully coiffed man could hardly be plotting to topple the state. But the elegant exterior hid a furnace. He would refuse a bribe with one hand and borrow double with the other to buy the votes he needed. He could even advance a man who had dishonored his own household if it suited the game, turning the scandalous Clodius into a political tool despite the insult to his marriage. His marriages charted alliances more than affections. He first wed Casucia, a rich heiress, then divorced her to marry Cornelia, Cinna's daughter. He bravely defied Sulla's order to put her away. After Cornelia died, he married Pompeia, then dismissed her after the infamous rights incident, declaring, in the phrase that echoes still, that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. He married Calpurnia next, tying himself to a family known for Epicurean tastes and easy morals, and even proposed later to reshuffle marriages around him for advantage. For all his calculating nature, he had a careless courage that could charm and chill at once. Captured by pirates off Pharmacusa for 38 days, he mocked them, demanded they raise his ransom because he was worth more, read them his verses, shushed their campfires when he wished to sleep, and promised laughing that he would hang them all. Freed, he raised a force, captured them, and crucified them. At the last moment, moved by a flash of pity, he ordered their throats cut, an easier end than the long agony of the cross. Kindness and cruelty lived side by side in him. He wept quietly when shown Pompey's signet ring after his rival's murder, restored Pompey's statues in Rome, and could be magnanimous to foes. Yet he also ordered brutal reprisals. At Uxellodunum, right hands were hacked from prisoners. The Veneti's leaders suffered harsh fates. After making peace with the Usipetes and Tencteri, he attacked them disarmed, and slaughter followed on a terrible scale. In Gaul, his decade of campaigns ended with numbers ancient writers love to tally. Hundreds of towns taken, hundreds of tribes subdued, vast multitudes killed or enslaved. Vercingetorix, the proud Arvernian who had fought him hardest, was kept 6 years a captive and then executed, an ending grim but not unusual in that world. He could be cutting with words too. When the tribune Metellus tried to block him from the treasury, Caesar warned, very softly, that speaking those words was harder for him than doing what he threatened, which was to kill the man. Yet with common soldiers and common people, he had a remarkable touch. He shared marches and hardships, traveled 100 miles in a day when war demanded, forded rivers by diving straight in, slept in his litter or curled on a chariot floor, ate whatever came, famously swallowing an asparagus dish mistakenly dressed like an ointment without complaint. In later years, he drank no wine, whether by choice or health, the old sensualist turned abstemious general. And so he came to Alexandria in the weeks after Pharsalia, master of Rome at last, polished, poised, alert to opportunity. He knew how finely he cut a figure, the pleasing consciousness, as one historian put it, of his own manly beauty. And he knew what it meant to arrive as victor on the world's brightest stage. He had crossed seas intending to head off Pompey's recovery. Instead, he found a murdered rival, a troubled kingdom, and a young queen who slipped through the night wrapped in a bundle to stand before him, laughing, breathless, alive with nerve. It was easy for Caesar to admire courage, easier still for him to court it. His ambition did not rest because he loved a quieter room. It simply turned, as ambition does, to the nearest door. This one opened onto Egypt, a city of marble and light, a palace over the sea, and Cleopatra, clever, fearless, and at that moment the brightest path to power. For now, let the harbor wind ruffle the torches on the palace quay, and picture Caesar, elegant, dangerous, fascinating, listening deep into the night as Cleopatra tells her tale. Tomorrow will bring judgments and battles. Tonight, only the murmur of water, the measured rise and fall of voices, and the beginning of a bond that will change both their worlds. Picture Alexandria in late autumn, heat softened by sea breeze, the great harbor bright as a mirror, the royal quarter perched on the Lochias headland like a marble ship. Julius Caesar had come intending to pause, assert Rome's authority, rest his nerves, and wait for Rome to settle after civil war. Then, in the hush of one night, Cleopatra slipped into his chambers wrapped in a bundle of bedding, and everything changed. They spoke through the hours. She, 20 or so, quick and daring. He, 54, seasoned and curious. She laid out the plain truth. Their father Aulitz had willed that she and her younger brother Ptolemy should rule together. Instead, she'd been pushed out. Caesar listened, weighing justice and advantage, and felt a second motive rise beside the first. Desire, yes, but also the tidy usefulness of a queen's loyalty in Egypt, the richest granary and most strategic port in the east. By dawn, he had decided, restore Cleopatra, cool the boy king's circle, and draw Egypt into his orbit. At sunrise, he summoned Ptolemy. The sight of his sister beside Caesar sent the boy into a storm. He fled the room, tore off his diadem, and roused a noisy crowd outside. Caesar stepped out, spoke calmly, promised a settlement, and convened a hearing. He read Auletetzel's will aloud, brother and sister to reign together. A reconciliation, formal if not heartfelt, was arranged. Cleopatra's eyes shone, Ptolemy's were red. He sensed, as anyone might, that his power had slipped. Caesar knew Alexandria's temper. He wanted the city soothed, not inflamed, so he offered gifts in the Roman way. Cyprus, recently annexed by Rome, would be granted to the two younger royals, little Ptolemy and Arsinoe, to administer in Egypt's name. Whether Rome fully yielded the island at once is murky, but within a few years it was indeed under Egyptian control. He also addressed money. Auletes had piled up massive debts buying Roman favor. Caesar set a comparatively modest figure to settle, 10 million denarii, a eschewing any punitive war tax, though Alexandria had leaned Pompey's way. It might have worked, but Pothinos, the eunuch minister who steered the young king, worked as hard to undo it. He ordered royal gold and temple vessels melted openly, had wooden dishes set on the king's table, spread the tale that Caesar's greed had reduced them to this, and fed the Romans bad grain with a shrug. To Caesar's face, he hinted that a man with business in Rome shouldn't linger in Egypt. He was also whispering to Achilles, the army commander. Sparks caught. Caesar moved first where it mattered most, the sea. He burned the ships in the western harbor, the war galleys once sent to Pompey, the guard ships, dozens of others, denying the enemy a fleet and keeping only what his small force could crew. Fire leapt along the quays. Later writers would blame this night for the loss of the entire famous library. But early sources are quiet on such a total ruin. Whatever burned, Caesar pressed on. He seized the Pharos lighthouse and the island's eastern tip, securing the harbor mouth and a door to the open sea. On land, he fortified the palace quarter. Walls, towers, anchored ships beneath the marble steps, enough to sleep soundly, even with a dagger's rumor in every corridor. And then, within those safe walls, a winter brightened. Caesar could laugh easily when he chose. Cleopatra was lively, keen, and crucially free. If a ceremonial sibling marriage had been enacted, it had not been lived. Their companionship deepened quickly. In late October, news arrived from Rome. Caesar would be dictator for the coming year. That steadied everything. He set work aside with a veteran's shrug and spent long hours with the queen, while the boy king sulked at the edge of the court. Two jolts ended the holiday mood. First, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe slipped out of the Roman lines with her guardian Ganymedes and joined Achilles. Bribes crossed the camp, ambitions flared, and soon Achilles was dead, murdered in a quarrel, and Ganymedes took command. Second, Caesar learned Pothinos was plotting murder and escape. The warning came from an anxious palace barber who heard more than a barber should. During a feast, Caesar had Pothinos seized and beheaded. Harsh, but in keeping with the world they lived in and the man's own part in Pompey's end. The siege tightened. The enemy fouled the palace waterworks that ran underground from the lake behind the city. Caesar tried to cut south along the broad avenue toward the lake harbor and met bloody resistance. Then his men sank trial wells within the lines and, to their relief, struck fresh water. Soon after, help glimmered offshore. The 37th Legion had arrived from Asia Minor with supplies. Caesar left enough men in the walls, took ships manned by his Rhodian crews, sailed out, joined his reinforcements, beat back Egyptian vessels north of Pharos, and returned in triumph to his moorings beneath the palace. Growing bolder, he circled Pharos to strike the Egyptian fleet in the western harbor beyond the Heptastadion, the long causeway that stitched island to city, and landed on the island's west end, capturing the forts. His plan was neat: hold both the island and the causeway, split the city, and bite into the western quarter. But at the Heptastadion, the tide turned. While Romans pressed from the island and from boats in the great harbor, Egyptians counterattacked from the far end, trapping Caesar's men on the narrow spine. They fought hard, then came the scramble to the boats, the crush, the cold slap of the sea. One ship bearing Caesar swamped under the weight of men. The conqueror of Gaul slid into the harbor like any other soldier, one hand lifting a packet of papers clear of the water, his scarlet cloak gripped in his teeth, ducking his head beneath thrown missiles as he swam. They hauled him aboard another vessel, soaked and shivering, the precious cloak lost to the waves. 400 legionaries and many sailors drowned that day. For the first time, the war felt less like a chess problem and more like a hazard. He could have left Egypt. His ships moved when he wished. Supplies reached him from Syria. He had sailed out and back already to meet a legion. But he stayed, partly for Cleopatra, partly for the prize Egypt was, and partly because he knew a hammer was marching to him across the desert. That hammer was a relief army from the east, Mithridates of Pergamum, a natural son of the great Mithridates, Antipater the Jew, father of Herod, and Iamblichus of Emesa, an Arab prince, bringing men along the Sinai road. They stormed Pelusium, fought beyond the Canopic mouth, and moved along the delta's eastern edge toward Memphis. The Egyptians shifted what they could spare from Alexandria to meet them, bringing men along the Sinai road. Here Caesar made a cold, clarifying move. He released King Ptolemy to his own people. Officially, it was to let the king negotiate peace. In truth, Caesar saw what the boy saw through tears. Once back with the Egyptian army, Ptolemy would rise or fall without Roman protection, and the will that bound him to Cleopatra would no longer bind Caesar's hands. The king begged to stay. Caesar sent him out. The end came fast. Caesar slipped his garrison out by sea, feinted east, then under night landed west of Alexandria and marched along the desert's edge to join his allies near the apex of the delta, north of Memphis. Across the Nile, Ptolemy entrenched at the foot of a tell with river, marsh, and canal guarding his flanks. After 2 days' hard fighting, a Roman officer named Carphalenus turned the Egyptian position and broke into their camp. In the panic, the young king leapt into a boat. Too many followed. The boat sank, and the Nile closed over him. They found his body later by the weighty gleam of his golden corselet. He was about 15. With that, the awkward question was gone. No need to share the throne. No princely captive to display in Rome. On March 27, 47 BC, Caesar entered Alexandria in triumph with his cavalry. The citizens came out in mourning robes, carrying the images of their gods, asking mercy. Arsinoe and Ganymedes were handed over as prisoners. Caesar rode through the city to the palace, and there, as conqueror and savior both, he was welcomed, openly gladly, by Cleopatra. So the siege ended where that first night's conversation had begun, with a queen restored and a Roman master pleased, with Egypt, for the moment, quiet beneath a sky of winter blue, and with two figures, one young and fearless, one seasoned and relentless, standing together on the Lochias above a gleaming sea, already thinking of what might be made from victory. When the young king Ptolemy was lost to the Nile and Alexandria finally yielded, the fighting went quiet at last. Caesar moved back into the royal palace on the sea-washed headland and turned from war to housekeeping. Egypt needed a shape again. Cleopatra's surviving brother, another Ptolemy, about 11, was no firebrand. Caesar and the court agreed he would take his elder brother's place as Cleopatra's junior co-ruler and, by custom, her formal consort in name. Caesar had once dangled Cyprus before this boy and their sister Arsinoe, but Arsinoe was now a prisoner, and the boy was too young to cause trouble with an island of his own. So that gift was allowed to fade. To the city that had fought him street by street, Caesar chose leniency. The smoke-scarred quarters and smashed quays felt punishment enough. He did, however, grant Alexandria's Jewish community equal rights alongside the Greeks, a thank you for help during the siege, and a pinprick to local pride. And for the future, he left something Rome understood, a garrison. 2 legions that had endured the palace siege, soon joined by a third from Syria, would remain as an army of occupation, there to steady Cleopatra's rule and keep the peace. He set an able, loyal officer named Rufinus over them, a former slave freed by Caesar himself, so that control of Egypt would sit firmly in Caesar's hand, not in the Senate's. It was April now. Caesar had been in Egypt more than 6 months, longer than he had ever intended. At first, he had planned to head home in late autumn, but riots, a siege, and then victory, and Cleopatra had kept him. The delay gave him time to think bigger thoughts. He had seen the green breadth of the delta when he marched. He heard often enough of the rich taxes paid, not in coin but in grain, millions upon millions of bushels. He learned how merchants rode the Nile to Coptos, crossed the desert to Berenice on the Red Sea, then sailed on the monsoon to the Indian coast near Muziris, how that trade was swelling year by year. He listened to talk of Ethiopia far upriver, of Arabia across the sea, of routes that could lead him toward the same horizons Alexander had chased. Such imagining kept company with another, closer reason to linger. Cleopatra was expecting a child. 7 months had slipped by since that bold midnight when she arrived wrapped like luggage and turned a Roman general into an ally, and more. The queen's wit and fearlessness had kept Caesar's attention through campaign and council. Now the quiet of waiting settled on the palace. The old campaigner felt a tenderness he did not often admit. He wanted to be near her, and, being Caesar, the private hope and the public vision braided together, an heir, perhaps a son, who might unite a Macedonian royal house and Rome's rising power. In Egypt, Cleopatra did what queens had done before her. She let priests and artists tell the story the people could love, that Ammon himself, the great god Jupiter Ammon to the Greeks, had come to her, and that the child would be divine in origin. Reliefs were carved in southern temples at Hermonthis, near Thebes, showing the god in human form and the heavenly company attending a royal birth. Dates in later years would be counted from the union of Cleopatra with Ammon. It was an old Egyptian way to answer a public question with a sacred pageant, and it worked as it always had. Caesar did not flinch at divinity. His family boasted descent from Venus through Aeneas. His hero Alexander had been saluted as son of Ammon and shone with the ram's horns on his brow. Living daily beside a woman addressed as a goddess, ruling by right as absolute as sunrise, the Roman found his thoughts tilting more openly toward kingship than ever before. He did not take the Egyptian crown. That would have stirred too many Roman ghosts. But in Egypt, he was treated as Cleopatra's consort, and through her eyes he could see a future throne not of one city, but of the world. Cleopatra too could see it. If Caesar, already dictator in Rome, embraced a crown in fact if not in name, who better than a Ptolemy to found the royal line with him? Macedonian by blood, heir in legend to Alexander's house, she offered ancient right to match his conquering will. Their child might bind east and west with name and lineage, Ptolemy by Egypt, Caesar by Rome. While they waited for the baby's time, Caesar would not sit idle. He wanted to know the country that, in a sense, he now shared. A royal river expedition was prepared. Cleopatra's great Thalamagos, the houseboat with colonnades and painted halls, gilded detail, and even little shrines for Venus and Dionysus, was readied for the queen's comfort. Behind it came a broad flotilla, scores upon scores of Nile craft carrying soldiers, stores, and attendants. They left Alexandria for the river's arms and drifted south past Memphis, where Cleopatra perhaps first looked on the pyramids and the Sphinx with her own eyes. They reached Thebes in a few weeks. Caesar walked temple courts and colonnades that seemed to outlast time itself. Later tradition would credit Cleopatra with bringing an obelisk from Luxor down to Alexandria. Whether or not that memory is exact, the urge to carry Egypt's grandeur to her capital belonged to the spirit of their age. The fleet pressed on toward the first cataract at Aswan. There, the labor of dragging ships against the river's broken stair, the rising south winds, and the grumbling of tired troops made a farther push unwise. Caesar turned the prows north again, his notebooks full, harvests counted, routes learned, the measure of a country taken. Back in Alexandria at the turn of June into July, the palace waited in a hush that every house knows when birth approaches. Then, in the first week of July, the child came, a boy. They named him Caesar, more tenderly, Caesarion, the little Caesar. In Egyptian records, he would also be Ptolemy, who is also called Caesar. The priests rejoiced in the myth they had proclaimed. The mother held her son, and the father, satisfied at last, looked again toward the horizon. For months, he had set Roman politics aside. He had not even bothered with dispatches. But the dream that had ripened in Egypt would require hard marching. to quiet the Mediterranean's edges, to break Parthia's pride, perhaps to touch India by the sea road he now knew. And then, when the world was gathered under his hand, to declare openly what had become privately true, his union with Egypt's queen, her wealth and lands allied with Rome, and a single rulership to bind them all. It was a grand design, and very likely within his reach, had knives not waited for him in Rome. Modern voices sometimes say he wasted his time in Egypt, playing at love while business languished. The simpler truth is quieter and deeper. Those months were the cradle of an empire. The idea took shape there, by marble steps above blue water, in the company of a woman who thought in dynasties and spoke to his highest hunger. Others would carry it on after him, first Cleopatra, then Antony, and finally Octavian. When Caesar's ships raised sail and glided out past the lighthouse, he must have looked back at the palace gleaming on the Lochias. The harbor spread like polished stone. The wind hummed in the rigging. He was eager as ever to get on with the work. But another picture traveled with him, the one no soldier's march can shake free. A shadowed room, a small queen quieter than her legend, and in her arms a newborn boy with two names and one future, drowsing at the threshold of history. When Caesar finally left Alexandria, summer light still glittering on the harbor, he moved with his usual breathtaking speed. A swift galley bore him across open sea to Antioch, then onward to Ephesus, where fresh news reached him. A Roman general of his had been beaten in the north by Pharnaces, son of Mithridates. Caesar did what Caesar always did. He rode hard toward the trouble with only 1,000 horse, gathered 3 legions en route, and met the enemy near Zela. The battle was sharp and short. Afterwards, he wrote to a friend in Rome 3 words that make the world smile even now: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He returned to Rome at the end of September, then sailed again before winter, this time to North Africa, where Pompey's surviving allies, Cato, Scipio, and others, stood with King Juba. On the shores near Thapsus, in early April, Caesar shattered them. Some died by their own hands, others by the sword. The armies broke and scattered. He came back to Rome in late July, 46 BCE, and began to plan his greatest public celebration yet. He also sent word south and east to Alexandria. Come. He wanted Cleopatra in Rome, and with her, their little boy. Whether she arrived just in time for the triumph or a breath after it, the effect was the same. The Queen of Egypt, quiet but unmistakably regal, entered the capital with a small whirlwind of attendants. Eunuchs, nurses, scribes, and guards shepherding a bright-eyed toddler who looked, to many eyes, very much like his father. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, came too, more for safety than for show. Caesar lodged the Egyptian court across the river in his gardens beyond the Tiber, a handsome villa set among shaded walks. His legal wife, Calpurnia, kept her own household inside the city walls. Rome, as always, murmured. The triumph itself lasted 4 days, one for Gaul, one for Egypt, one for Pontus, one for Africa. Elephants carried torchbearers up the Capitol by night, rare animals padded past the cheering crowds, models of the Pharos lighthouse and the old man Nilus rolled along on carts, and a great placard reading Veni, Vidi, Vici bobbed before Caesar's chariot. Some moments felt bitter. The Gallic hero Vercingetorix, long a prisoner, was strangled after his parade. In the Egyptian procession, Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe was shown in chains. And when, on the African day, trophies taken from Roman foes were displayed, more than a few onlookers winced. Yet the city roared with approval all the same. Caesar was dictator now for a 3rd term, more confident than ever, and he wanted Cleopatra to see how fully the capital leaned toward him. The queen's presence created less of a scandal than later storytellers pretend. Romans knew she was Macedonian Greek, not Egyptian by blood. Alexandria was a Greek city in its manners and learning. But there was discomfort. Cicero muttered that he detested her. Others pitied Arsinoe and whispered about Calpurnia. Caesar, as usual, shrugged and did as he pleased. In the villa across the river, the reunion was easy, almost domestic. The first fever of their affair had cooled, but the bond held, tempered now by purpose. Their son, about 14 months old, already showed his father's look and gait, a resemblance that pleased Caesar more than he let on. The two adults understood one another. Witty, ambitious, impatient people planning on a scale that made others dizzy. In truth, they were already husband and wife in everything but Roman law, and both assumed that, in time, even the name would follow. Publicly, Caesar knit Cleopatra into Rome's sacred story. In late September, he dedicated a new temple to Venus Genitrix, Venus the ancestress of his own Julian line, and in that marble sanctuary he placed a statue of Cleopatra. In Egypt, she stood for Isis Aphrodite. In Rome, she could be read as a living image of Venus. It was a bold act, but the city's mood was ripe for it. The cult of Isis was popular. Foreign gods were crowd favorites, and Caesar staged the dedication with all the sparkle Rome loved. Gladiators, pageantry, even a mock sea battle on an artificial lake. Most of the crowd accepted the idea with a cheer. A mighty man and a near-divine queen united under Venus' gaze. Behind the spectacle, Caesar's health flickered. He had begun to suffer more frequent epileptic seizures. On bad days, the fits and their shadows left him irritable, grand, and strangely sure of his destiny. Cleopatra, raised in a court where rulers were addressed as gods, would have found nothing odd in that. If anything, she met his swelling certainty with her own quiet conviction. Kingship was not a boast, but a role she knew by birth and ceremony, and she wore it lightly. Amid reforms large and small, one change from that season touches every calendar on our walls today. Rome's months had drifted badly out of step with the sun. Caesar, likely prodded by Egyptian expertise, brought in astronomers, among them the famed Sosigenes of Alexandria, and reset the year. To catch up, they stretched 46 BCE into a long, unruly 445 days, then set a new rhythm, the Julian calendar. From that reform, our modern reckoning descends, a Roman-Egyptian gift to time itself. All the while, Caesar looked east. Old itineraries from Pompey's wars sketched an overland road beyond the Black Sea, through Caucasian passes and Parthian lands, toward the riches of India. After months in Egypt, with Alexandria's merchants talking in his ear about monsoon winds and the Red Sea route to Muziris, the dream sharpened. To reach the farther world by land, one obstacle stood in steel-tipped certainty: Parthia. Caesar began to plan the campaign. Trouble came first from the west. The Pompeian cause found new breath in Spain. Caesar, impatient to be done with it, secured absolute power for the next year. Consul without colleague, dictator still, appointed urban prefects to govern in his name, and marched. At Munda, in March of 45, he stamped out the last great embers. 30,000 opponents fell. Pompey's elder son died soon after. The younger escaped into the hills. Caesar returned to Rome, reconciled with Antony, offended some by celebrating a triumph over Romans, and then, perhaps feeling magnanimous, raised up old enemies. He restored Pompey's statues to their pedestals and pardoned several leaders, including Brutus and Cassius, who would later conspire against him. Through these months, Cleopatra remained in Rome, the quiet star of Caesar's gardens over the river. She moved carefully, without show, letting the city grow used to her presence. In private, the two of them kept shaping that wide design they had first traced in Alexandria. Rome and Egypt, law and lineage, old gods and new orders, and a child with two names and one future. Caesar drilled into reforms. He gathered surveys and maps. He set timetables in the measured cadence of his new calendar. The road east waited. So did everything they had imagined beside the Nile. For now, Rome drowsed and chattered and feasted, as Rome always did. The Tiber slid past the garden walks. In the villa, the boy learned to walk with his father's step, and the queen from the bright city across the sea watched, listened, and planned, knowing the tide that had carried her to the heart of the Republic was still on the rise. Rome in the mid-40s BCE was no longer a republic in spirit. One man, Julius Caesar, now carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. After years of civil war and conquest, the Senate no longer argued with him. It merely echoed his will. They voted him 10 years as consul and whispered about making him dictator for life. Across the marble halls, the name Caesar was spoken with both reverence and unease. Cicero, the old orator, grumbled that he was receiving letters of thanks from foreign kings he had never even heard of. Caesar makes and unmakes monarchs, he sighed. Rome had become less a city that ruled the world than a distant office managing its branches. To Caesar, this was all as it should be. He had marched through Gaul, Britain, Egypt, and Africa. He had stood beneath so many suns that the world itself felt smaller than his ambition. Rome, smoky and crowded on its 7 hills, seemed merely his administrative base. And through Cleopatra's eyes, he had glimpsed something larger still, an empire that could stretch across continents, lit by the wealth and brilliance of the East. Alexandria was no longer foreign. It was a second capital waiting for him. But the strain of carrying a world empire showed. Friends began to notice how gaunt he looked, how the old fire sometimes gave way to a kind of weary sharpness. The seizures came more often now. He would grip the edge of a table until the tremor passed, then brush off his attendants with a laugh. When warned of plots against his life, he shrugged. Death can only come once. Yet he kept working, restless and brilliant, always reaching higher. In the golden villa beyond the Tiber, Cleopatra watched all this unfold. She had lived at Caesar's side for 3 years now, and no one, no senator, no general, no philosopher, spent more time in his company. History often imagines her only as a lover, but that underestimates her. She was a ruler in her own right, the living heir of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic kings. She understood dynasties and the art of rule as Caesar understood armies. When he spoke of reorganizing provinces or founding colonies, she listened and advised. When he dreamed aloud of monarchy, she did not flinch. For her, the word king carried no shame. In Egypt, rule was divine. A sovereign was not chosen, but born to stand between gods and men. Sitting beside her, Caesar absorbed that certainty. Many Romans suspected as much. People whispered that Caesar meant to crown himself and make Cleopatra his queen, that he would shift the empire's heart eastward to Alexandria, away from the muddy Tiber and the cramped Roman streets. The rumors found easy ground. Rome was not a city of comfort. Its alleys stank. Floods came and went. Disease festered in the heat. Compared with Alexandria's marble boulevards and glittering harbor, Rome was provincial. And perhaps Caesar agreed. He spoke often of founding a new Rome elsewhere, one better suited to the empire's scale. Later, Augustus would nearly do it, choosing Byzantium as a possible new capital. The seed of that thought was Caesar's. During these last months of his life, Caesar's plans turned openly imperial. He accepted the hereditary title Imperator, once merely commander-in-chief, now transformed into something royal. The Senate's decree made it hereditary, and everyone knew to whom it would pass, to the small child in Cleopatra's care. Ptolemy XV, the young brother who had once shared her throne, quietly vanished from history. Some said he had been poisoned, others said fever. None could prove either. What mattered was that Cleopatra's baby, Caesarion, the little Caesar, was now king in Egypt, and one day perhaps heir to Rome itself. Caesar's public image changed with purpose. His statues appeared in the robes of the old kings of Alba. His coins bore his face crowned with gold. A throne was set for him in the Senate. He carried an ivory scepter, rode in a consecrated chariot, and was granted burial rights inside the city walls, the privilege of Rome's ancient kings. To some it seemed natural, even thrilling, to others ominous. Cicero wrote to him pleading not to become king. The plea was never sent. Others tried subtler flattery, suggesting he be king only over Rome's provinces abroad, not Italy itself. Caesar listened, smiled, and gave no answer. Yet temples were already decreed in his name, one to Jupiter Julius, another bearing the inscription, "To the immortal god." Priests were appointed to tend his cult, as Egyptians tended the living gods of their pharaohs. A bed of state was placed for him inside the temples, beside the altars of Jupiter. The Republic's faith was quietly becoming a faith in Caesar. By the winter of 45 BCE, Caesar's divinity was public theater. During processions, his image was carried among those of the gods. He was addressed by orators not as commander, but as divine Julius. Many ordinary Romans, weary of chaos, found comfort in it. The idea that one man, half god, half human, could steady the world appealed to them. But others felt the tremor of tyranny beneath the marble calm. Cicero muttered that Rome had traded liberty for worship. The Senate still met, but senators now waited long hours for audience, only to be dismissed by a nod. Caesar's temper, once quick but controlled, grew sharp. When a tribune failed to rise as he passed, Caesar mocked him for weeks afterward. When someone set a crown upon one of his statues, and tribunes removed it, he dismissed them from office in fury. Meanwhile, Cleopatra, proud and regal, mirrored his tone. Her attendants strutted through Rome in Egyptian silks. The senators disliked their foreign manners. Poets whispered of a queen's arrogance. Cicero, ever ready with venom, wrote that he detested her insolence. Yet in the streets among the crowds, she remained an object of fascination, the goddess from the east, mother of Caesar's son. Caesar's mind, never still, turned toward new horizons. The Parthians had humiliated Rome years before. He would avenge that defeat, march across Mesopotamia, perhaps even reach India, as Alexander once had. The merchants of Alexandria had told him of that overland road from the Caspian to the Indus, of silks, gems, and spices that poured westward. To conquer Parthia was to open the gates of the world. He planned for 3 years of war, appointing magistrates to rule Rome in his absence. Engineers brought him maps of canals and roads, new harbors, bridges, and libraries. He even planned to cut through the Isthmus of Corinth to join two seas. The Senate could scarcely keep up with his projects. And through it all, Cleopatra remained by his side, both participant and witness. Yet her heart grew uneasy. Caesar's health was fading. His headaches and seizures grew worse. The longer he delayed his coronation, the more uncertain her own future became. She needed him alive to secure Egypt's independence and her son's future. Without him, both might vanish into Rome's grasping empire. Then came February 15th, 44 BCE, the festival of the Lupercalia, an ancient Roman rite older than memory itself. Every year, 2 young men would sacrifice a goat and a dog, smear themselves with blood, and run laughing through the city, striking passers-by with leather thongs said to grant fertility. The day, chaotic and joyful, celebrated renewal. Caesar had recently reorganized the festival, creating a new order of priests, the Luperci Julii, and he himself presided that year, seated on a golden throne in the Forum. Imagine the scene: the winter sun over marble roofs, drums echoing, a crowd pressing forward. Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, was one of the runners, broad-shouldered, half-drunk with excitement, swinging his thongs at laughing women. Then, flushed and panting, he bounded up the steps toward Caesar's throne. In his hands he carried a golden diadem wrapped in laurel leaves. A hush fell. Voices from the crowd shouted, "Hail the king!" Others fell silent. Antony raised the crown high, offering it to Caesar. For a heartbeat, all of Rome held its breath. Caesar hesitated, then waved it away. A murmur, then applause. Again Antony pressed it upon him. Again he refused, smiling thinly. The cheers rose louder this time, grateful and relieved. He gestured for the crown to be taken to the temple of Jupiter. "Let the gods keep it," he said, and the moment passed, awkward and unresolved. It was meant to be a trial balloon, perhaps arranged between Antony, Cleopatra, and Caesar himself, but it failed. The people were not ready for a king. After that day, Caesar knew the throne must wait. He would march east first, conquer, and return in triumph. Then Rome would be ready. In the meantime, Cleopatra must go home. He promised her honors, wealth, and a future. She began to pack her treasures, her household, her little boy. He made his will. It left money to the citizens, estates to his relatives, and favored his grandnephew Octavian. Cleopatra's name was not in it, nor Caesarion's. But everyone understood that the will would change once the monarchy was born. He was dictator for life now. He could afford to wait. In those final weeks, Cleopatra lingered in Rome, restless, half believing that Antony might yet crown Caesar before his departure for Parthia. But the signs were ill. The Senate whispered, the streets buzzed with tension. On the Ides of March, 1 month after that festival, the knives would find him. Yet for now, on quiet February evenings, Cleopatra still walked the gardens of the villa by the Tiber, her child in her arms, the air cool with the scent of cypress and river mist. She looked eastward, toward the sea and her kingdom, wondering whether she would ever again see the man who had promised her a throne. And somewhere in the city below, torches flickered through narrow streets, and the voice of a singer drifted faintly upward, telling of heroes, of kings, and of the fleeting breath between greatness and downfall. As the last winter of Julius Caesar's life faded, his house across the river, the villa where Cleopatra and the little boy Caesarion stayed, saw a steady trickle of visitors. Among them came Mark Antony. He had quarreled with Caesar the year before and been forgiven after the Spanish campaign. Since then, he was often at Caesar's side again. Antony was quick and changeable, eager 1 week, brooding the next, and he had known Cleopatra years earlier in Alexandria. He noticed her now too, and in the weeks to come he would speak up for her son. Caesar, for all his brilliance, was never a sharp judge of character. He drew flattery like a lamp draws moths. Around him stood practical men like Balbus and Oppius, and a handsome young opportunist named Dolabella. Caesar meant to make Dolabella consul when he left for the Eastern Wars, a plan that stung Antony, especially since Dolabella had once tangled messily with Antony's family. Whispers grew. Antony and Dolabella might even be plotting together. Caesar laughed them off. "I don't fear comfortable men," he said. "I fear the lean ones." Among the lean was Gaius Cassius, bitter, principled, and quietly furious at any hint of kingship. It was Cassius who began the plot to kill Caesar. He drew in senators one by one until he reached the man whose name mattered most, Marcus Brutus. Brutus was an earnest soul, a mind that fed on principles the way a meadow feeds on rain. He had reasons both to love and to resent Caesar. His mother, Servilia, had long been Caesar's companion. Some thought Brutus might even be Caesar's son. His wife, Portia, was the daughter of Cato, who had died after Caesar's victories. Brutus balanced these ties as best he could and tried to do what he thought Rome required. Cassius left him notes on his official chair. "Wake up, Brutus. Are you truly a Brutus?" The appeal to duty worked. Brutus joined. By early March, 60 to 80 senators had sworn themselves to the deed. Caesar planned to leave Rome on the 17th. If he were to be crowned or publicly honored before he went, it would likely be on the Ides, March 15th. The conspirators set that day. The city felt strange in those days. Reports of odd lights in the sky, ill-omened birds, and sacrifices that yielded no heart. A soothsayer told Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March." He shrugged. That evening, March 14th, he dined with friends and was asked what kind of death he considered best. "A sudden one," he said, and went home. Near midnight, his wife, Calpurnia, started from sleep, weeping from a dream of his murder. She begged him not to go to the Senate at dawn. Morning brought another bad sign from the augurs. Caesar hesitated. The Senate was meeting that day not in its usual hall, but in a portico beside Pompey's theater, beneath the statue of Pompey himself. As the hour passed, the conspirators grew tense. Had Caesar changed his plans? They sent Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's trusted men, and secretly one of the plotters, to fetch him. Decimus found Caesar wavering and pressed him. The Senate, he said, meant to grant him a royal title, king over all Roman lands outside Italy, and the right to wear a diadem beyond the peninsula. Would Caesar insult them by staying home because of a dream? The promise, whether rumor or lure, worked. Caesar rose, took Decimus by the arm, and set out. On the way, 2 different men tried to hand him warnings. The soothsayer, seeing him pass, murmured, "The Ides have come." "Yes," Caesar smiled, but not gone, and he walked on. Outside the meeting place, Antony was engaged in friendly conversation by Trebonius, another conspirator, kept just far enough away. Inside, the senators stood as Caesar entered and took his seat. Tullius Cimber approached with a petition to recall his exiled brother. Others pressed close. When Caesar gestured them back, Cimber seized his toga and pulled it down. The first dagger struck from Casca, awkwardly to the shoulder. Caesar caught his arm and shouted, "Villain, Casca, what are you doing?" Then the rest were on him. Cassius, whom he had spared at Pharsalus, Decimus, who had just coaxed him from home, blow after blow from men he had promoted, forgiven, or fed. He fought a moment with the sharp metal stylus he used for writing, then staggered toward the base of Pompey's statue. There he saw Brutus coming, blade drawn. "You too, Brutus, my son?" he gasped, and the fight went out of him. He fell, and the knives finished their work. The conspirators, sweating and shaken, turned to speak to the Senate and found empty benches. Everyone had fled. They stumbled into the daylight with their bloody daggers held high, calling for liberty and the old republic. Doors slammed. The streets emptied. Antony slipped away in disguise. By nightfall, the assassins held the capital. The next day, Brutus spoke to the crowd from the rostra. He was heard respectfully until another orator, Cinna, went too far and the mood snapped. The conspirators retreated to the hill once more. Antony reappeared at dusk, went to the forum, and stood over Caesar's body. Calpurnia, hollow-eyed, entrusted him with Caesar's papers and treasures. The following day, a general amnesty was proclaimed. The city inhaled. Then Caesar's will was opened. To every Roman citizen, he left money, 300 sesterces each. To the people, he left his riverside gardens and estates. Of the rest, 3/4 went to his grandnephew, Octavian. The remainder to 2 other relatives, with Octavian named as official heir. There was also a list of guardians for any child Calpurnia might bear. Unlikely, but noted all the same. 5 days the body lay in the forum, while the city argued and mourned. On March 20th, Antony spoke the funeral oration. He lifted Caesar's torn robe on a spear for all to see, the fabric punched through with dagger holes. The crowd wept, then raged. A poet named Cinna, only guilty of sharing a name with the earlier speaker, was seized and killed in a blind spasm. Benches and tables became fuel. A pyre rose in the open square. The flames leapt, and brandishing torches, the people surged toward the houses of the assassins before order could be forced back upon the streets. An act of oblivion followed, a blanket pardon. Brutus and Cassius were assigned distant provinces. Antony and Lepidus presided in Rome, hosting the plotters at dinner as if to seal a brittle peace. For Cleopatra, the world seemed to tilt. In a single morning, she lost her ally, her lover, and the future he had promised. A shared crown, an empire knit between Rome and Egypt, and a path for their son. There were rumors of another will, one that might have named Caesarion, but if such a paper ever existed, it did not surface. She feared for her own safety and for the boys, and she looked for the one man who could steady the ground, Antony. Antony moved quickly. He told the Senate that Caesar had acknowledged Caesarion as his son. Oppius objected and later wrote a pamphlet denying it. The argument wasn't idle. If the public accepted the child as Caesar's, Octavian's claim would weaken. And if a child needed a guardian, who better than Antony? Meanwhile, the political boards were shuffled. Dolabella seized the consulship. Assignments changed hands. Brutus and Cassius gathered troops for their provinces. Before long, word came that Octavian, just 18 and recovering from illness, was on his way to claim his inheritance. Rome tilted again, split between those who rallied to Octavian and those who rallied to Antony. In that heat, Cleopatra received firm advice: leave. Whether for safety or at Antony's urging to raise ships and men in Egypt, she accepted. A letter from Cicero dated April 15th mentions she had already fled the city. Quietly, with nurses, guards, and the toddler Caesarion, Cleopatra boarded ship and turned her prow toward Alexandria. The crossing gave her time to think. Grief loosened its grip just enough for resolve to take its place. Caesar was gone, but not silenced. For 7 nights, a comet had burned over Rome. Many swore it was his soul taken up to the heavens. Priests now named him a god. Statues soon bore a star on his brow. Cleopatra, daughter of kings and called divine in her own right, took comfort from this. If Caesar had truly joined the immortals, then her task on earth was clear: protect their child and continue the work they started. In Alexandria, 2 Roman legions remained. Egypt's coffers were deep. The merchants' ships could be mustered. She had allies to court and enemies to watch. And she had a card no one else could play: a small boy with his father's walk and eyes, heir to Egypt by blood, and, she believed, to wider realms by right. The sea breathed against the hull. The boy slept. Night after night, Cleopatra stood on deck beneath a pale sky and measured the distance still to go. She had arrived in Rome as a daring young queen. She returned to Egypt a woman tempered by loss, sharpened by years at the center of power, and prepared to fight for the throne that once seemed within her grasp. If the shape of that throne must change, if the road to it now wound through Antony, through councils, through battle, so be it. Somewhere behind her, Rome murmured its endless debates. Ahead, the Nile waited, broad, steady, old as memory. And over both, that new star burned on, as if marking a promise that power could change hands but not fade, that a story interrupted might yet be resumed, and that a child asleep below decks could carry a world upon small shoulders, given time. You've been listening to Whispy History, where the past whispers and time stands still for a little while. If this story kept you company tonight, let me know what part lingered in your thoughts, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help these quiet journeys continue. Until next time, rest easy, dream deeply, and remember, history is never really gone. It's only sleeping, waiting to be told again. Good night.